Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our VASCL webinar on a superintendent's guide to moving the new standards through the classroom doors. We're very excited about this. And I'm pressing buttons as I'm talking, and I can't do two things at the same time. So good morning. I'm going to turn this over to Pam Moran. She's the executive director of VASCL and former superintendent of Albemarle, who's going to introduce her team, and we're going to get started.
All right. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see folks here, and I know we'll have some folks still dropping in to join us as we just get started today. But what we're trying to do, and we started last year with an assessment guide for superintendents, and this year we wanted to refocus on what is it that superintendents need to know, understand, and be able to do to be able to lead staff in the field to implement all of the new standards that are getting piled on the plate pretty rapidly in this cycle, to be able to really get those implemented and implemented well so that all students will have the best shot possibly of successfully mastering the standards for the purpose of learning first. But I know that also in everyone's mind is we also want them to pass those assessments that come either in the fall or the spring at the high school level, but definitely for everybody in the spring. So that's what we're about today. And I will tell you that what we're going to be doing is, and we think that regardless of whether you're a superintendent, a central office leader, or a building level principal who may be joining us today, that everyone will hopefully find something that you can take back that will be helpful to you, as well as to be able to contribute to the conversation in terms of what you're doing and how you're approaching this in your systems. So we see this as truly a collaboratively big networking event for VASS members and their designees today. I will tell you that what you are going to see, and you'll meet our panel group in just a minute, is a 30,000-foot view. How does a superintendent think about this work? How does a upper level, cabinet level, assistant superintendent, central office leader lead this work? How does a principal at the building level think about leading this work? And then we also have a coach with us who's focusing on when you really bring it from that satellite view through the district or division view down to the classroom. What is it that our classroom teachers need boots on the ground to be the best that they can be in terms of implementing standards so that kids are learning those things that we believe are important to learn? So that's where we're going to get started today. And the first place that we want to go is to our panelists. And I'm just going to start by, Amy said, I'm Pam Moran, that I am VASCL, the Virginia School Consortium for Learning Executive Director. I also am a former superintendent, assistant superintendent, director of curriculum and instruction, middle school principal, elementary school principal, coordinator of gifted science and professional development. So whatever seat you're in, I've probably been pretty close to it. So thank you for having us today. And I'm going to turn it over to Brian and let him kick off, and then we're going to round through who we have with us here today.
Thanks, Pam. Good morning, everyone. Brian Nichols, proud superintendent. I'm entering year 6 in New Kent. So we'll share some of the structures that we're going to be doing. I'm excited to be here, but I'm even more excited that I get to bring one of the best principals in the business to really share her perspective. So Chris, I'll kick it to you.
Good morning. I'm Chris Pilger. This is my 34th year in education and my 15th year as a principal, second in New Kent, and I am very happy to be here.
Thank you, Chris. Let's kick it up to Steve.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Steve Geyer, Assistant Superintendent of Instruction with Goochland County Schools. This is year 12 in this role for me, former 11-year elementary principal, and prior to that, middle and high school English teacher. Excited to share this morning, and similar to what Brian said, everyone knows you've got to surround yourself with great instructional leaders to make this work happen. And I am blessed to have 2 incredible instructional coaches in Goochland, and one of them is here with us this morning, and I'll kick it over to Shelley Olson.
Hi, good morning. I'm Shelley Olson and excited to be here. I am one of the lead instructional coaches in Goochland County. This will be my 4th year in Goochland, and prior to that, I was in Boston, Massachusetts as a school leader, and I've been a math teacher for middle and high school as well. I work a lot with science and math. My other half does a lot of the English and humanities and history side of things, but I will do my best to represent her as well today.
Thank you, Shelley. So let's get moving on today. And we have 3 framing questions. One is about what are the challenges that you're really seeing right now? And you may be seeing some challenges here in July that you didn't see in the spring. And we bet that you're probably going to continue to see that happen over the course of the year as these new standards are implemented in classrooms across your divisions. We also are really interested in how not just the team that we have with us is moving the ball down the field in terms of this implementation process. And we do want to note that these standards are not our our grandma principal standards back in the 1990s. These standards are at an incredibly different level of expectation of learning for kids. And we'll do a little bit of work around that today. And then lastly, we want to also focus on that our team is bringing to us 4 or 5 actions that we think are incredibly important in the implementation process. And we know that you probably have some actions that we may not have identified that you think are incredibly important too. So one of the things that we want to do is to be sure that we're going back and forth as we move through today so that you have opportunities to share, whether it's in chat. We also have a breakout room planned, but we want to have opportunities for us to learn together. So anytime something comes up that you think is important to share, please put it in the breakout or discuss it in the breakout room or put it up in the chat room. So let's get started. The first thing we'd love to do is to open up the chat room for just a couple of minutes, and we don't want you to start writing yet. What we want you to do is to really think about what are you already doing in your divisions. It could be around alignment of curriculum or maps or pacing guides. It could be who you've put in charge of leading the work. It could be what are staff doing well? What's keeping you up at night about this work? What is it that you think you're really nailing right now? We'd love for you to think just a minute about that and then put that in the chat, but don't hit your send button. And then what I'm going to do is in a minute, I'm going to ask everybody to hit your send buttons together. And we're going to do a little bit of what we call a waterfall inside the chat room. So just take a minute to reflect on these questions, put something into chat, hold your finger from hitting that send button. And in about a minute, I'm going to ask you to do a send. And we appreciate everybody reflecting and being willing to share where you already are and what worries you. So if you're joining us late, we're writing in chat room right now a response to where are you right now? What's in progress? What do you feel is going well? What do you worry about? And we're asking you just take about a minute to reflect on that. And then we're going to ask you to hit a send all together. And so everything will go into crowdsourced into the chat room. And then we'll take a minute for you to look through and see what everybody's doing. If you don't mind in that write that you're doing, the write-up that you're doing, if you don't mind introducing yourself also, just hi, I'm a superintendent where, or I'm a central office leader where, or a principal. That would be great. Okay, take about another 20 seconds and then we're going to post them all into chat. All right, let's go ahead and post. Just hit your send buttons and let's see what shows up in here. We're going to welcome Marcia from Nottoway. Hey, Carmen, good to see you here. Adam, thank you for joining us from Radford. Up, Antonia. Antonia is our vice chair of VASCL's executive board this year. Welcome, Antonia. Katie Akamak, yay, out on the shore. Thank you for joining us today. Josh, what a great strategy, a pairing strategy for teachers to work together. Thank you, King and Queen. Hey, Kathy. And Brian, I'm wondering if I might kick this to Steve and you and see if there's anything as you're looking through some of these. Thank you, everybody, for all over the state. Drew, Highland County, for sharing where you are and what you're doing. Anything that Steve, you and Brian right now, in looking at what people are putting into these, as well as your own perspectives from your roles, the seat that you're in, anything that you would like to respond to as you're looking at some of what people are putting into chat?
I'd like to say that I'm glad I'm not Chip and I don't start school on August 7th. I have a little more time than he does. Outside of that, just really kind of what we're going to talk about today is it's the balance of everything coming at us at once, whether it's standards, and I don't know that we can call it a standard when it changes as often as it does, but we manage that. Especially the toll that it takes on elementary school and them having to navigate all of those things, Virginia Literacy Act. And so, yeah, that balance piece is critical. And we'll talk about what we're focused on. We'll also talk about what we're not focused on right now.
Steve, would you like to jump in and share some of your reflections, seeing what everybody's experiencing right now?
Yeah, great to read the perspectives in the chat. And I guess what strikes me most is, we're constantly focused on innovation and preparing our kids for the future. And sometimes I think work like this, it really is getting back to the basics and just making sure that we're truly unpacking the standards, that our teachers and our school level leaders know the standards, and that there's alignment between the standards and our pacing guides. There's alignment between the standards and our resources that we're putting in the hands of teachers to deliver the standards. And that's not necessarily super innovative work. It feels kind of basic, but man, is it important. If we're going to do justice to the new standards, we've got to kind of go back to, for those of us that have been doing this for a while, what we did 20 years ago to really unpack and roll our sleeves up to do that work. And so that's a takeaway for me for sure.
I remember I was an elementary principal in 1998 when we did the very first pilot SOL testing round. And so it was the first time that we'd had standards, the first time that we did statewide criterion reference testing of those standards. And I think that about 2% of the schools in Virginia were accredited in that round in 1998, in that pilot round. The next year it got a little bit better, but it was a long process of figuring out how do you do this work and how do you keep that balance on that the test is not the objective, learning is the goal, and how do you really do what you can make sure you do to bring really great teaching strategy, learning intentions, success criteria, PLC work, data analysis to the table, but keep in mind that the goal is that our kids become great learners and successful learners, and that the test is just one measure of that. So we're going to move on. And the first place we're going to go is that we're going to ask each of our panelists to talk a little bit about these bullets. So how is it that right now that you're focusing on the kind of professional development so that every teacher, particularly novice teachers coming in or teachers from out of state, are really able to wrap around the standards? How do you really focus your resources differently maybe on these new standards? And how are you making sure that the things that need to happen, the changes that need to occur from the seat you're in, whether it's a principal, a coach, a assistant superintendent or superintendent, that those things are happening. And then what we'd love to do is to invite you that if we miss something in this, please jump into the chat room and share what you're doing that may add value to the session that we're doing today. So I'm going to kick it to Brian and Steve and Chris and Shelley to take us into how are you taking planning and making it actionable right now?
I'll open up just for a second and then really push it to Chris, because Chris has been leading this work at the building level for us. Really, our focus on this started at some point last year and really diving into that. It's just become everything that we're doing. For example, today, starting at 10, we have a regional leadership conference that we're hosting here at New Kent. So leaders from across a couple of regions will be here, and we're focused on these standards and how we're going to roll it out and really leaning on each other with that. But Chris has a ton of ways that we've already been working on this and kind of taking that planning into action.
You know, like a lot of you have said in the chat, you know, curriculum department's been working hard. We've been pacing. We've pulled teachers in to work on figuring out what will work best, what order, and making changes to assessments and to pacing guides and curriculum. Within the schools, we are tightly planning with teams, and all of our specialists are working tightly with them. One of the things that we're going to have to really focus on is that teachers do what they're comfortable with. So this is going to be out of their comfort zone. It's going to be something new, and it's going to be a lot of change, and we can't make student change unless the teachers are changing how they're teaching. They can't rely on Google Slides they made 2 years ago or something on Teacher Pay Teacher, because it's not going to hit the level of rigor that's needed. And I think you'll see that when we get further into some specific standards. But you know, we're changing our walkthroughs so that we can specifically be looking for certain pieces, so that as we are meeting in PLCs biweekly and as we're sitting in on plannings, we're there to support them hand in hand.
Yeah, and I love what Chris just described. I know in Goochland, there's been a lot of communication along the way to prepare folks for the changes, and a lot of messaging around we're in this together and we're going to be there to pick each other up and dust each other off and get back at it, because it is going to be a lot of new for a lot of folks. The other thing that strikes me is that divisions of different sizes have different resources to deploy to the work. But I do think there's something really important, even in large divisions. Obviously, Goochland's a small division. We rely heavily on our teaching staff to do a lot of the curricular work that's likely done by specialists and other division level folks in larger divisions. But I think teachers really do need to be a part of this on the ground level in terms of unpacking those standards. And so from a budgetary standpoint, we did a lot of work over the last couple of years to plan for supplemental compensation to bring teachers in over the summer and bring teams together working outside of contractual hours. And that's been really impactful for us. Our teachers would say they've been glad to be part of the work rather than have it handed to them and part of the decision making. And I would think that would translate in medium size and large divisions as well. And Shelley's been boots on the ground. She and our other lead instructional coach really leading this work over the last couple of years, and can't say enough about her leadership.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've tried to do over the past few years is think like start big picture and look at what are the like bigger changes first, and then drill down. So we started really early in the fall last year around like some of the big changes that might be coming, and then started to dig into having like so vertical and horizontal teams come together around looking at specific standards. We're now at the place where we have grade level teams across the division coming together and starting to really dig in on their planning for the beginning of the year. And then we'll continue to do that at the school level as well. I think the other thing that's been really intentional about some of the work that we've been trying to do is in what Dr. Geyer was saying about making sure that our teachers are involved in the work. Also making sure that we're very explicit about and intentional in our scheduling of planning and supporting teachers throughout the year, so that it's embedded in the work that they're doing and it's not something extra, but it is the work. And then really making sure that we have resources that we feel confident are aligned.
Chris,
Piggyback off. Oh, go ahead.
I'm going to come back to you, Chris, because you mentioned something, and you may illuminate it a little bit more as we get deeper into our discussion today. But one of the things that you talked about is that you've already been planning ahead, organizing ahead for scheduling, even at the PLC level. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we've really worked on our master's schedule, my assistant principal and I, to plan out the dates for all our PLCs and looking ahead at our pacing and our curriculum to say, what are we going to need to focus our time on at that point in the year and that specific month or that specific quarter, so that it's proactive rather than reactive. We also have, data spreadsheets that are transparent to all the coaches, all the specialists, the curriculum department, and all the teachers, so that we can really be on top of data throughout the year as we're making changes, because we don't want to get to the end and realize that we didn't adjust something well. So it's really about being proactive. If it's in your calendar, you're going to do it. You're much more likely to do it than if you just fly by the seat of your pants and say, oh, I'm going to go and observe here today, or I'm going to have this meeting today, and you sit down at your meeting and you don't know what you're even going to talk about. We plan out our walkthroughs and observations on our calendar so that we know who we're hitting, who we're talking about, so that at our A-team meeting on Friday, which we do every Friday, we specifically can address certain things we've noticed on certain grade levels or followed up on. We sit with our instructional coaches at that meeting also, and our specialists, so that we can all be tag teaming. It's like truly all hands on deck.
Awesome. Brian, you mentioned that, that question about how do you make sure, obviously you can't be down at the level where Chris is or Shelley is, but you also have sort of a similar system to Chris for being sure that you have a sense of where your principals are, departments. Can you talk a little bit about that as a superintendent?
Absolutely. The first lesson is you hire amazing principals like Chris, and the work gets a lot easier. But for us, it really comes down to the structures that we have. Chris, mentioned it. Your calendar shows what your priorities are. So we have our leadership development schedule set. We have our one-on-ones with principals and their teams set. So all of that is on the calendar. Our joint walkthroughs that we're going to do for the year are set. And we make sure we coordinate that with them. So it's not one more thing, but it fits in with the work that they're doing in the calendar. So we're really using that calendar to drive our work and make sure we have structures in place as we all learn this together. And I think that's the other piece, from our paraprofessionals to our teachers to everybody. We're learning all of this together. So we're going to make some mistakes, and it's going to be a little messy, and there'll be an implementation dip. We're just going to try to minimize what that dip is by putting in those structures to support. And then we always have a promise that we'll come back and look at those structures. If it's not working or it's too much, then we'll pull this back, because we know we're balancing many things, whether it's the requirements under VLA for teachers and the amount of training they have to do, which is quite comprehensive and cumbersome, to anything else that we have going on, making sure that we have those in place. So what are your structures? What does your calendar say your priorities are? And then we just have to let go of some things that aren't going to be our focus going into this year.
And I think I learned as a superintendent, actually, I think I learned the hard way as a principal, that what you pay attention to is what other people pay attention to. And I learned that if the highest priority work that we were doing in our schools was not on every agenda, whether it was a leadership agenda, a principal level agenda, or a one-on-one, that leaving it up to chance that things were going to happen that need to happen sometimes would backfire on me. So I really learned you do have to attend to every structure, that if this is a high priority for your system, you better make sure that it shows up everywhere, every time you have an agenda that you're building. So thank you all for sharing some of that. The next thing that I'm really interested in is that we know that continuous feedback is really critical at the teacher level, the principal level, the central office level, at the superintendent level. And I'm wondering, you've talked a little bit about some of these things, but I'm wondering about how you do this sort of what I call the 4 L's. You lead the work, people know that this matters to you, that it's important, it's a part of your visioning work, mission work for the system. You're listening to people, you're learning yourself what's going on. and that you constantly are looping back through that process. So I'm wondering if Steve, you and Brian might chat a little bit about, and maybe Chris jump in from a principal level. How do you really engage in feedback with people that are responsible for ensuring that this work does get implemented with fidelity and with focus?
Brian, you want to jump in? You want me to start? Yeah, I'm a few things that have obviously already been discussed. I think you've got to have structures in place to facilitate that communication. And so what does that presence look like from the division level in terms of meeting structures? We have quarterly data meetings with our principals to get feedback from our principals. We involved and continue to involve our teachers heavily in a lot of the decision-making processes related to choices around instructional materials. We did a lot of piloting last year of materials, which is kind of a step we hadn't taken before. The analogy I've used before is you generally don't drive by a house that you're interested in purchasing and go ahead and make an offer. You typically walk through, there's usually a home inspection, there are other pieces to it. And historically, at least in my experience, when choosing resources, we're really not kicking the tires as much as we probably should. And so we put a lot of time and energy last year into piloting math and ELA resources and gave our teachers a tremendous voice in the process. And so I think it's going to translate into a great deal of ownership around the choices that we've made and the materials they're using. So we're looking forward to seeing that in action. And then the other thing, hearing my colleagues talk, is just the importance of the principalship and the role that principals play, small division, large division, and leading this work, probably even more critical in larger divisions where central office maybe can't have the same level of presence. And hearing Chris describe her process at her school, it's so important that the principals really are leading the work at the school level and prioritizing his or her time to demonstrate what those priorities are by way of walkthroughs, et cetera. And so for division level leaders, you're not going to be able to do it on your own. You're going to need to have coaches and principals helping with that day-to-day leadership at the school level.
Awesome. Somebody said, Chris, can we get a copy of your walkthrough form? I told y'all that people would want what you're doing. Do you want to talk a little bit about your walkthrough and just how you use that in a feedback?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. And I was also going to say that, the lead, listen, learn loop, it's really all about transparency. One of the things I love about working with Dr. Nichols is he's very transparent, and we as administrators are very transparent. And so I'm very transparent with my staff, and we're part of everything. They could tell you what my focus is on any given day, as well as could Dr. Nichols. And, I know we're in a small county now, but I was in Newport News, which is much larger. And it was the same thing. You can't be doing this on your own. So whether it's in this group or whether it's at your school, it's everybody has to be in this together to make all this change happen. Part of our focus with our walkthroughs actually started with adopting new literacy curriculum and trying to make sure that with VLA and with our new literacy curriculum, we were going to make sure that we were focusing on all the right pieces so that everything comes together smoothly. Well, with the addition of all these new standards and the rigor, the change in what kids are going to have to be able to say and do, and the change in what teachers are going to have to say and do differently, we needed to be able to have things that were tangible, that we could actually go back to, sit and have feedback meetings, so we could look at all the different pieces and look at the level of rigor in questioning, look at whether their learning targets and objectives were focused on the right thing because they've been so used to something very different. And it's going to be stressful for them. And we've got to try and make it as comfortable and open and transparent as possible.
Thank you, Chris. I want to just notice that Carmen up in Alexandria City has noted that they do division walkthroughs as central staff. And one of the things that they do is that they tier their schools based on accreditation status and differentiate interventions and supports based on where schools are. So that's an interesting way to do that. And people may ask you a little bit more about that, Carmen. So be on the lookout for some questing focus about what you are doing with that more tiered model in a larger system. The other thing that we believe is that you continuously have to be upgrading your knowledge. So we're going to turn this over to Shelley right now, who's going to make sure that everybody in this group, regardless of the role you have, understands that while you may not have to teach math or teach reading to kids, obviously, in your roles, you have to have some deeper understanding of what those expectations are. So we want to just roll into this a little bit. And this is something, by the way, our slideshow will be available to you through Amy if you have any interest in going back to dig in a little bit deeper on using something like this with your staff. So Shelley, I'm going to kick it to you, and you can just let me know when I need to pop slides forward.
Great, thanks. So I think one of the biggest takeaways, like almost our elevator pitch on what the new standards are doing, to kind of wrap our heads around it, is that all the new standards, math, reading, and science and history, even in their new states as well, have incorporated these 0.1 standards, or these process standards, and in reading it's the developing skilled reader standard. And what those have done is we've talked a lot about those as the skills and how we're embedding those skills and that level of rigor into the content that we're teaching. I think science, and I know science has been new for a few years now, but like as a perfect example of what that looks like, where the science and engineering practices come at the top, but often we think about the content that we're teaching throughout and ask ourselves, where are we implementing and embedding those practices into those content standards? And the same thing goes really for our math, our new math standards, as well as our new reading standards that just came out, and English standards. So really asking yourselves where you see those things in the classroom and what you see for students. So this is one example. We looked at some kindergarten, and I would actually say in our unpacking of the standards, we're taking, I mean, it's a similar approach, but slightly different approach to looking at the standards, and not just looking at the verbs and the changes in some of the words, but really asking ourselves, why do we think these changes were made? What process standards are we seeing embedded in the new standards? And also, what are the implications for instruction and assessment? And to do that so that it's actually like what we actually are doing and what we want kids seeing and doing in their classrooms, and not just relying on jargon and assumptions about, oh, we all know what reason mathematically means. Well, we might think we know what that means, but let's actually talk about what that means in relation to this assessment item question. So here's a assessment item that we have for a grade level. How can we take a question that was aligned to the 2016 standards and really embed those process standards for math in particular to change the rigor and make sure that we're addressing this new standard? And working from something and modifying it has actually been a really powerful experience for our teachers and for our leaders in making sense of what those new standards look like, and not just giving it like, oh, now they have to reason more, and now students have to justify more. So this is an example for kindergarten, where in the past, the standard was very much like identify days of the week, name the months of the year. But really how we're thinking about having students reason about time. And so here's an example of a kindergarten question that our teams have looked at around, instead of just saying what are the days and what are the weeks and what are the months, here are some pictures of things that you do every day as a student or as an adult and as a community member. How would you sort this? Is this something you do daily? Is this something you do weekly? Is this something that you would do on a given month? And then name those things as we go. So it just changes the rigor of the question, but showing and having teachers think through and principals think through, like, what would this actually look like for our students and what they are doing and producing, has made the standards make more sense, as opposed to just sticking to the, like, they're more rigorous.
I would also add that one of the things that strikes me is that this is really a different kind of vertical progression, where if you're not building that reasoning, analytical, synthesis skill set starting in kindergarten, your third graders are going to be at risk because they've not had that experience to build those 0.1s into content. So one of the things that I think about is that kindergarten teachers may say, well, what's the big deal here? But it is a really big deal because it is a vertical progression in that reasoning sort of theme, that rigorous thinking theme that's emerging from these new standards.
I would also add that this is why we can't let teachers rely on slides they made years ago and teacher pay teacher things that are cute, but don't hit where they need to hit now. If they rely on the old things, it won't change. And that, while we might have lots of common assessments that grade levels are doing as a whole that are district-wide assessments, teachers still do formative things in the classroom. They're going to have to make adjustments to those things, and that's going to be hard. So that's going to be part of those conversations that we have to dodge through as we move throughout the year.
It's a really different expectation for kindergartners to do this kind of work compared to name the days of the week.
And I am partial to math, so I'm going to stick on math for just a minute. But one of the things that I think is really powerful to do in terms of that vertical progression in math, we had teachers kindergarten all the way to senior AP level teacher, AP calculus teachers in the same library at the end of our school year. And what was really cool is we started talking about the data standards in particular, and that progression is incredibly evident in those standards because we're asking students in kindergarten to formulate questions and to use the language of formulate questions. And obviously we have to instruct to be able to ask kids to do that, but that travels all the way up, and having people really think about the impact of what's happening for our youngest students as they get to our AP calculus classes. It's really a powerful kind of opportunity there. This is another example of, this is an 8th grade math example. Again, where the 2016 standard really asked students to compare in order. And we had like a lot of our math guru teachers looking at the new 2023 standard and saying like, but what is that actually, like when they say use multiple strategies, which that's one of the things that you're going to see a lot. Well, what does that actually look like for kids? What do you mean by that? Like, yeah, I teach all of those things, but when we think about how we assess that and what we ask students to do again, and the implications on that for what our instruction looks like in the classroom. So while we look at the assessment, we also ask ourselves, okay, if we're going to increase the rigor on the assessment question in this way and change it, what does that mean in terms of what my instruction has to do so students can actually meet that expectation? And so the next slide just shows an example of this kind of question around comparing and ordering. Comparing and ordering is something students are doing from kindergarten all the way to 8th grade. And what's really cool in the new standards is that there are opportunities for kids to do this on those representations. Like we've incorporated a number path in kindergarten that's going to have students really then translate into these number line ideas. So in the past, you would have seen this question with all of those different numbers and just said like, put these numbers in order from least to greatest. And to shift and change the level of rigor on this, some of our teachers looked at this and said, you know what, instead, let's actually have the students sort these numbers and turn into the column that best represents their value. Is the number closer to this number, closer to -2, closer to -1, or closer to 0, and talk about why. And that just really changes an understanding. It takes it from a procedural component, just strictly procedural kind of execution, to making sense of these numbers and the magnitude of them.
And Shelley, I'll do a little plug for VASCL right now, because if you're a VASCL member, you know that you have access to our really robust assessment bank that has been upgraded. We've been working for 2 years now to really align with new standards. But one of the things that we know is that the old traditional items, even the TEIs, are not necessarily going to grab the kind of rigorous thinking that you're seeing in these examples. And we are going to see, just like we did with science with cluster items, we're going to see some open-ended and constructed response kinds of items in math and in reading and in science and in social studies, that where kids have to show us or demonstrate, not just pick one of 4 answers, which is the past of SOL testing. So it's really important. So if you're interested in knowing more about VASCL, if you're not a member, let me know. If you are a member, coming soon, all of our new assessment items and tasks will be uploaded by August 1. So keep us moving. This is where you've kind of broken out, how do you do? What do you talk about with your teachers? And
Sorry,
you're
I was muted, yes. I kind of just talked through this, but I think the biggest takeaway I would say for any of the standards, to make sure that we're really understanding what the changes are, is having teachers, having building leaders, having central office leaders ask themselves, what does this new standard ask students to actually do? What would the product look like for this, so that it doesn't just become about the material or the resource, but how students are actually demonstrating that they are able to meet those expectations. So this is an example of a protocol that we've used with teachers, just looking at the progression of a standard. Where do we see the depth? Where do we see those skills in the process standards embedded? And how does that, asking the people to really talk about how that leads to a deeper understanding, and then look at some of the assessment items that you have in your division to have teachers either modify them and change them, or create something new that would address the new standard. So this is just for reading, and this is one of the new components of the reading standards or the literacy standards, which is that all of them have this one standard on developing skilled readers. And then what we're doing with these is these are all skills that are embedded into the other standards throughout the trajectory of like K all the way up. So look at a 6th grade example really quickly of that. And then I remember I said I'm partial to math, but if you look right here at the 2017 standard, it does have identify, it has explain and describe in what we're asking students to do around fictional texts. But the difference in the new standard is that we're asking students really to use textual evidence, which is one of the skilled reader skills, to do and demonstrate comprehension. And then they're breaking it down into some of the other components of the developing skilled readers skill there, and really looking at not just being able to describe elements, but actually for example, in the craft and style, not just describe poetic elements, but to talk about the impact on the reader. Because that's what matters, is the reason we have those poetic elements is because it's something we want to actually like give a feeling to a reader who's reading. And that also really connects and translates to what we do as writers.
A much more sophisticated level of expectation for kids in literacy than we've seen to date. It's also my understanding that we're going to see a lot more nonfiction passages, and that the word is that they're trying to pull the nonfiction passages from content that kids would have learned in social studies or science, which kind of levels the playing field a little bit so that kids don't have to have that background knowledge from outside of school to potentially process some of that. So what we're going to do now is, Shelley, is there a wrap up on that, or are we ready to put people in breakout rooms?
Yeah, I think we can put people in breakout rooms. I think just big picture, you're thinking about where do we see any of these skills and the higher level that the skills are asking for, the process standards, the developing skilled readers, or the point ones embedded into the content of the new standards. And what does that look like for students and teachers?
We're going to show you a couple of examples, and we're going to let people choose. We've got 18 breakout rooms, probably more than we need. But what we're going to ask people to do is to either choose to drop into a set of breakout rooms where you'll talk about the math piece, or to drop into breakout rooms where you're going to talk about the reading focus. And the math is more elementary, but I think it doesn't matter. If you're interested in math, you can talk about this from the lens that it could be at any level. Same thing with reading. So we're going to look at 10th grade reading. Is that correct in this breakout? And we have some questions. What we want to do is to see if you can find in the passages that we have, and we are going to put the link to the slideshow back in again so that you can really jump in. Brian, Steve, Shelley, Chris, and I are all co-hosts, so we're going to come into rooms. But if you are interested in, I'm going to go back to the breakout rooms. If you're interested in the math piece, it'll be rooms 1 through 9. And I think we only need to use rooms probably 1 through 4 or 5. And the same thing for secondary reading. You'll have a chance to pick which one you want to go into, maybe rooms 10 through 15. And if you've got 2 people in there, that's great. If you've got 3 or 4, if you decide you want to move, we can move you to a different room. But I'm going to go ahead and we're going to spend about 8 or 9 minutes in the breakout. Chris, if you can go back up to the very beginning, I think that the slides I put in was the first thing I put in on chat. If you could grab those. And I'm wondering, Steve, I'm wondering if you might speak to, just in brief, what are you doing in Goochland to address the fact that all of those old assessments that we've been using for years to look at standards, that you're having to upgrade those. Are you back with us?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me, Pam?
Yes, I sure can.
Yeah, I'll talk just real quickly, big picture, and then maybe Shelley can talk more about what's happening at the classroom level. But I talked in our breakout session, I was going to mention it earlier to the larger team. I think connecting, probably everybody has some version of their own localized profile of a Goochland or of a Virginia graduate work. We are proud of ours, but it really got put on a shelf when the pandemic disrupted all of us. And so these new standards have really been a great opportunity for us to connect the profile work and those higher level skills, the analysis skills, the synthesis skills, the things, the communication, the things that we know are important to success after high school, but really difficult to measure with traditional assessments, to connect those higher level skills to these new standards, the associated SOL tests that are happening, and kind of breathing life back into the profile and saying, and we all know the cliche of what gets measured gets done. I think it's going to get measured now. And I think there's a lot of good in these new standards. It's just unfortunate timing that it's all kind of feels overwhelming as it's happening all at once. And I think it's absolutely okay to acknowledge that with our teams and let them know that there are going to be bumps in the road. And so we have been working over the last year plus on doing exactly what Pam described, which is bringing teams together to develop assessments that better reflect these new standards. And I'll ask Shelley to jump in and she can talk about kind of where we are in the work and what's left to be done.
Sure. So we have done a few different things with that. And one is obviously starting with the standard always. And like I was saying before, looking at what we have and thinking about how we would change that so that it does meet it. I think starting there is really important. We also kind of laid a foundation for like quality assessment and what that looks like. So we as teams, like we had teacher teams from all the different schools come together to say like, when we're looking at quality assessment, like what does that mean in terms of like the distribution of question types and distribution of level of rigor of questions and things like that, to try to set a bar for what we were trying to get to with our assessments when we created them. And then we took former assessments that we had, we like literally cut up questions and did some hands-on activities around like Frankensteining together a new assessment that we felt like was taking some of what we had and changing it and increasing the rigor on it, and also looking for holes in what we needed, especially in terms of the level of rigor of certain questions, and creating questions or modifying questions so that they would meet that expectation.
Thank you, Shelley. And we are right at the wrap up. So we wanted to just review real quickly the areas that we focused on today in 1 through 5. And I think that every one of these helps to form that system of change management that really supports up staff to go from where we were in a current state to where we need to be in a desired state. Steve, I'm going to let you, and I think Brian had to hop off, that if you have a summary focus that you can just say, quick takeaway from me from the conversations today, what would it be?
The quick takeaway for me is to just recognize that everybody's got to roll their sleeves up and really get into these new standards and make sure that we're not missing that critical foundation piece. That's so important.
Thank you. Chris, anything from you as a principal takeaway?
Be transparent, get things on your calendar, make sure you're not overloading reading specialists with all the changes in curriculum and the VLA. They have a different load this year and they're going to be busy.
Thank you. And Shelley, from your sort of boots on the ground, what do you think the folks that are at the top of the food chain in terms of positional authority and empowerment, what do you think they need to be thinking about, or from your perspective?
I think involving teachers in the work, respecting teachers as professionals in that is really important, and making sure that they feel heard in that. And also really recognizing the load on our staff right now, which I think everyone really is doing, and thinking about how do we support and make sure that our students are actually getting what they need.
Thank you. We do have some resource links at the end that we think are really helpful as resources to help build knowledge and background, whether it's at the central level, the principal level, or the teacher level. So those are in the slideshow. And we just want to say thank you for joining us today with our VASS partners and VASCL partners. And if you're interested in knowing more about VASCL, you can connect with me at pmoran@vascl.org, and I can tell you more about the organization. We do have 2 great upcoming workshops, institutes, one on language arts, one on math, that is going to those will happen in October, with the goal that teachers will be able to come in and say, okay, now that we know what we're doing, what else do we need to know? So if you're interested, those are going to be posted on the VASCL site pretty soon. So thank you for being with us here today. Amy, back to you. And I think we have concluded our webinar.
Yeah, I want to just say thank you, Pam, and your team, Chris and Shelley and Brian and Steve. Thank you for your information day and expertise. You have a lot of resources to share. This has been recorded, so I will edit it to take out that breakout part, because you'll just be looking at me. And then I'll send that recording to everybody along with the slideshow. And Chris is going to see if she can share those the walkthrough forms, and I'll send those as well. So everyone have a great day. Thank you for joining us, and we appreciate everyone.
Yeah, and a shout out to Brian Huber. We haven't talked in a while. Get in touch. Thank you. All right. Thanks.